Welcome to the CGTN special on the 50th anniversary of the People's Republic of China's return to the UN. I'm ELAINE Reyes in Washington, D.C. October 25th marks a historic day for the People's Republic of China and the United Nations. On this day in 1971, the People's Republic's seat at the UN was restored.
新中国恢复在联合国合法席位以来的50年，是中国和平发展、造福人类的50年。中国将坚持走和平发展之路，始终做世界和平的建设者；坚持走改革开放之路，始终做全球发展的贡献者；坚持走多边主义之路，始终做 国际秩序的维护者。
Equatorial Guinea? Yes. Ethiopia?
Yes.
Yes. Poland?
Yes.
Yes. Portugal?
Yes.
Adopted.
新中国 恢复在联合国合法席位，是世界上的一个大事件，也是联合国的一个大事件。这是中国人民的胜利，也是世界各国人民的胜利。
China.
"青山一道同云雨，明月何曾是两乡。" 让我们携起手来，站在历史正确的一边，站在人类进步的一边，为实现世界永续和平发展，为推动构建人类命运共同体而 不懈奋斗。
Sarah Walton joins us from UN headquarters in New York City. So, Sarah, you have covered the UN for some time now. What do you see as China's role within the organization?
Well, Elaine, I think we've seen that role develop recently and over the years since that vote in 1971. Analysts and historians will tell you that for many years through the 70s and the 80s, really up to the 90s, really, China was a pretty quiet member of the organization. But over time, it has grown its role and developed its influence, really. And that happened as China became more focused on global affairs in general. That happened at around the same time that the US really took a bit of a step back from its normal role at the forefront of international relations under President Donald Trump. The US is still really the major power at the UN, but those changes over recent years allowed other member states to exert their influence more, particularly China. And I think where we see that most clearly really is at the Security Council, where over the last 3-4 years, China has become far less cautious in using its political weight and standing up for its own interests there. For example, when defending the DPRK from UN sanctions. That's not the only area, of course. A big area is in peacekeeping, where China is now the second biggest contributor to the budget for peacekeeping, and it actually contributes more peacekeeping troops than the other permanent 5 members of the Security Council. Now, China has sadly lost peacekeepers on operations, so it has become very involved in safety. And analysts say it is really something of a leader now when it comes to setting policy for those blue helmet operations around the world. But China has grown its role in many areas of UN work. So the UN has thanked China for its involvement in development, for its role in tackling climate change, which is one of the main focuses of the UN, and particularly of the current Secretary General. And also in more recent years, the fight against COVID-19, where we've seen China donate more than 40 million doses of COVID-19 vaccine through the COVAX scheme. So we're seeing over the years this constant development of the role in across the wide spectrum of work that the UN does.
And Sarah, how do you see China's role moving into the future?
Well, I don't think we're going to see China step back from that growing role. I think one of the areas that we're going to see really a focus from China in particular is in climate change, something that's already become very important. As I said, is really one of the major focuses of the UN today. We've already seen China use the UN as a major platform to make announcements on climate change. So, for example, the pledge to go carbon neutral by 2060, and just last month at the high-level session of the General Assembly, President Xi Jinping made headlines really across the world when he made the announcement that China will no longer finance coal-powered power plants across the world. But analysts say really what's going to be key to China's role at the UN going forward is the relationships it chooses to have with other member states, particularly the US, being really still the most powerful country at the UN. Although there are big differences between those countries, big tensions, analysts say that if China can find areas that it can cooperate with the US at the UN, so for example climate change, then it has the ability to affect real change. And by being a leader in something as important as climate change, for example, that is how China could really cement its role as a major player at the UN.
All right, Sarah Walton reporting live for us from UN headquarters in New York. In his speech, President Xi Jinping reviewed what the past 50 years mean to China and to the UN and to the entire world. China's permanent representative to the United Nations, Zhang Jun, echoed that. He said China's development and contribution will be and needs to be remembered.
Over the past 50 years, the world has witnessed China's fundamental changes. More importantly, we've been holding on to our core values while contributing to world peace and development. It took 5 decades for China to get ever closer to the center stage. Another conclusion reveals itself. The country, the people, and the Communist Party of China have chosen the right path. We're confident and proud of that. History informs us a better China contributes to a better world. Going forward, we'll continue our course and open more opportunities to the world. A healthy coordination with the UN is one of our main goals and ultimate drives as a responsible member country.
The 1971 breakthrough at the UN came after many years of diplomatic efforts. Wang Siwen has more on that.
Maintaining international peace and security, promoting healthy relations and cooperation. Despite being a founding member and one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council in 1945, China's seat was still occupied by representatives of the Kuomintang in 1949, even though it was overthrown by the Chinese people. A long struggle to restore China's lawful seat at the UN began. For years, it seemed that every effort was met with resistance. Heavily influenced by Washington, the UN General Assembly repeatedly voted down resolutions on the matter. However, during the 1960s, China's case for the restoration of its lawful rights began to find favor with more nations. And in 1970, it finally had a majority within the General Assembly. A year later, a proposal by the U.S. to create what it called two Chinas, or one China and one Taiwan in the UN, was rejected outright by the Chinese Foreign Ministry.
The countries of the world were divided into two camps, the socialist camp and the US-led capitalist camp. China belonged to the socialist camp, and the world organizations primarily dominated by the so-called capitalist camp. In part because of the Cold War and also in part because of the Korean War, China and the United States became sort of enemies. So the US decided to support Chiang Kai-shek's regime to represent China at the UN and refused China's representation. That lasted for a long time.
On October 25, 1971, China finally got the breakthrough it wanted. The UN General Assembly adopted Resolution 2758 with an overwhelming majority.
Voting is as follows: in favor 76, opposed 35, abstention 17. The draft resolution adopted. China will be notified accordingly.
It restored all rights to the People's Republic of China and recognized the representatives of its government as the only legitimate representatives of China to the United Nations. China had waited 22 years. From being shut out to resuming its lawful seat to honoring its commitments for the past 50 years, China has been involved in the UN's undertakings and played an increasingly important role in the world body. Over the past 5 decades, China says it has made continuous efforts to support the United Nations. China currently contributes the largest number of peacekeepers among the permanent members of the UN Security Council. It has provided nearly $62 billion in assistance to 166 countries and international organizations, and is now taking action on climate change by pledging to peak its CO2 emission before 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality before 2060.
China has also benefited a lot from being part of the international system. Probably 10 years ago, Bob Zoellick, the Undersecretary of the U.S. State Department, he coined a phrase. He said China is a stakeholder of the existing international order. I think he's probably right. China still has a huge stake in the existing international order. China wants the order to be stable. China wants the world to be prosperous. China endorses the UN to play a larger role.
Following many early ups and downs within the UN, China finally found its feet on the international stage, and is keen to make a lasting and positive impact. The Chinese government says it will always stay true to its original aspirations and is determined to connect more with the world. Wang Suwen, CGTN, Beijing.
Iftikhar Ali was there at the UN General Assembly 50 years ago when it voted on China's legal representation. He was a Pakistani journalist at the time and called it an exciting moment he will never forget. CGTN's Fergal Ryan has more.
Yeah. And it's also celebrated because it was something everybody in the third world countries especially, and even some advanced countries wanted, that the United Nations should look like the United Nations. You see, with a universal membership.
China will be notified accordingly.
He rushed to the telegraph room of the UN headquarters and dispatched a flash message in the simplest words. China in, Taiwan out, APP, which stands for Associated Press of Pakistan. The veteran journalist has been covering UN news ever since. He says China's membership has somehow reshaped the world body.
China, the main role, in my opinion, was it gave voice to the voiceless. You see. It brought to the fore the real problems facing the third world and the poor countries. The second point I was making is decision by China to join the UN peacekeeping forces. It is now contributing among these permanent 5. It has it is contributing the largest number of troops, and they are in the field, and they have set an example of honesty and of fairness, and serving the cause of peace and security around the world, keeping peace in the hot spots of the world.
Earlier, the president and editor-in-chief of China Media Group, Shen Haisheng, wrote to Ali expressing admiration of his journalistic ideals of objectivity and professionalism. Shen also says that at a turning point of human history and a turbulent time because of the pandemic, news media must be even more responsible and mission-driven, since we are living in a world filled with both challenges and hopes.
This is what a journalist would write to a true journalist would write to another journalist. You see, and I fully agree with him on his main thrust of his letter, that there should be responsible journalism in the world.
For insight on 50 years of China's influence at the UN, I'm joined now by Einar Tangen in Beijing, a political and economic affairs commentator. Einar, first I'd like to get your reflections on all that China has accomplished and how it has grown in 50 years at the United Nations. Quite a milestone.
Elaine, you're absolutely right. I mean, if you start looking at what has changed over the last 50 years in terms of poverty reduction, in terms of a much fairer economic system, in the sense that not just a few countries hold all the GDP. If you look at how things have changed in terms of developing ideas about climate change, about reacting to things like the pandemic, China has been absolutely integral to that. And that is really things. I echo what the gentleman said before about China gave a voice to a whole new segment of the society, because 50 years ago, China was economically really at the very, very bottom. In the last 50 years, it has risen, but it has risen not in a way that has been threatening to other nations, despite all the rhetoric. It has been a responsible stakeholder. It has used the UN as a means of trying to settle disputes rather than taking unilateral action. And this is very important as we face, and Xi Jinping in his speech talked about, after COVID-19, after the pandemic, the world is going to be facing tremendous amounts of change, food insecurity, and the after effects of what's happening with the climate change, which will continue, and how the world is going to tackle those problems. Is it going to be together, which is necessary, or will it be fractionated? People deciding that they want to invest more in nuclear weapons that could destroy mankind, as opposed to trying to save the world, which is threatened by a real extinction case, climate change.
Well, that message was interesting because, as you mentioned, China has seen it all, right? When it started at the UN, it was in one position. So it has the advantage, I guess some people would say, from starting in one way, rising to the other. It wasn't just handed its seat and didn't always have the position that it has now.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where you get a lot of empathy. That's where the voice of others comes in. You have so many developing nations. Back then, emerging nations were not a thing. It was just the developed world and the rest. Today, you have a much more nuanced world, but it still needs a lot of help. China can remember those days, and it has sympathy and an understanding of what it believes is necessary to bring countries out of that. And you've seen that with the Belt and Road Initiative, with joining the RCEP, with saying that trade, infrastructure are the ways in which we can all go forward, that it's a win-win game, not a zero-sum.
All right, reflections from Einar Tangen in Beijing. Thank you so much for joining us. China's role at the UN touches so many issues. When we return, a look at China's impact on fighting the pandemic. And as we go to break, Sarah Walton takes us inside the General Assembly chamber for a look at China's seat on the floor.
This is the seat
from where China takes place in debates in the General Assembly Hall. You have these 2 rows of seats, there's a microphone to take part in the debate, an earpiece so you can listen to the translation of other people speaking. Most importantly, the sign here lit up to let everyone else know which delegation is sitting here. Now, member states are seated in here by country in alphabetical order. When the General Assembly elects its president each year, the Secretary General draws lots to see who gets seat number 1 over in that corner, then everyone else is seated in order after that. This year, it's Suriname over in seat number 1, so this is where China is seated for this session of the General Assembly. The General Assembly is the main policy-making body of the UN, and all 193 member states are represented here and have an equal vote. The organisation meets regularly between September and December each year, and then gets together as needed at other times to discuss key international issues. China helps appoint the Secretary General, non-permanent members of the Security Council, and it also helps approve the UN budget. In recent years, there have been big changes to how business is done here because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Each delegation usually has 6 seats, but since 2020, member states have been limited on how many people they can bring into the hall because of fears of spreading the virus. Meetings have been across 3 conference rooms to allow for social distancing. Delegates have also been able to attend meetings virtually, and the UN has introduced a system of e-voting, so members can take part in votes remotely. Sarah Walton, CGTN, New York.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
We are CGTN, China Global Television Network.
China has played an extensive role in the past year distributing vaccines through the UN's COVAX program. For more on its efforts to deliver vaccinations to Latin America, we turn to CGTN's Paulo Cabral in Sao Paulo. Paulo.
That's right, Elaine. And actually here in Brazil, the first vaccine to be used was Chinese, the CoronaVac vaccine. The first jab was given on January 17th this year here in the state of Sao Paulo. And one big reason for it to be the first was the agreement signed between the state of Sao Paulo through its pharmaceutical laboratory, Butantan, with Chinese firm Sinovac Biotech. This agreement signed in September 2020. But also interesting to say, this contacts, actually this could be so quick and streamlined because this contacts began much before in mid-2019 when a high-level delegation of the state of Sao Paulo traveled to China to make contacts with government officials and also with firms. Of course, at that time, the novel coronavirus had not yet even surfaced, but then when this became a global problem, these contacts were already made, and so the two sides of the world could start working quickly on a vaccine, on the trials, and then on starting using the vaccine here in Brazil. And also, this agreement with Butantan Institute includes not only the distribution of CoronaVac, but also full transfer of technology. So the expectation is that at some point next year, the vaccine that's now imported from China will be fully produced here in Brazil in the Butantan Institute. Right now, the CoronaVac vaccine responds for about 30% of the vaccine doses given here in Brazil, second only to the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, which responds for about 40%. But then another interesting thing, even though the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine was developed mainly in Britain in the Oxford University, its active pharmaceutical ingredient is also actually produced in China. It's made in China. So if you take the total of vaccines given in Brazil, about 70% of that has the pharmaceutical ingredient made in China.
So, Paula, besides the CoronaVac, what are some other Chinese vaccines in use in Brazil and across Latin America?
Well, right now in Brazil, Chinese vaccine, only the CoronaVac. Across Latin America, CoronaVac is also the most widespread, but there's also the Sinopharm vaccine and the CanSino vaccine. Both of these are also used in Latin America. And actually, the CanSino is probably going to soon to start to be used in Brazil because the Chinese firm has closed a deal with a local distributor to use their vaccine also here in Brazil. It's now in the approval process in Brazil's health regulatory body and visa, so expectations now also for this other Chinese vaccine, the CanSino, coming to Brazil. And now there is one big advantage of the Chinese vaccine, something that makes them to be quite widespread in Latin America, is that it does not demand some such extreme conditions to be stored, to be transported. For example, the temperatures, just regular refrigerators, about 8 degrees, they can hold the Chinese vaccine, so that makes it much easier to transport them in Latin America, particularly to more distant areas. If you're talking about Brazil and many other Latin American countries, you're going to think about the Amazon, for example. Just think transporting these vaccines to a faraway indigenous village in the Amazon. So the Chinese vaccines do have this advantage. They do not demand such extreme conditions to be stored and transported. That makes it much easier to use them in rural and distant areas of Latin America.
All right. Paulo Cabral reporting for us from Sao Paulo, Brazil. Thank you. Bolivia is one of the Latin American nations that has benefited from Chinese-developed vaccines. President Luis Arce made acquiring vaccines one of his first priorities when he took office.
When we became government, we started to look for vaccines in the world. Nobody wanted to sell because they already was, they already sold out all the vaccines. And we tried to talk to Mr. Putin as well for the Sputnik. And also I talked to Mr. Xi Jinping, who received it very well, and he said immediately he sent us vaccines, and we started to buy, Sinopharm, that is the vaccine that we are receiving regularly, and I have to be very grateful with Mr. Xi Jinping and all the Chinese government because we receive a very good cooperation from them.
Chinese-developed vaccines are in use around the world and have been critically needed on the African continent. Many nations are trying to increase access to vaccines as quickly as possible. Sierra Leone in West Africa is one of the countries that has relied on Chinese vaccines.
What we've had so far has been through the COVAX facility, and in addition, we've had some support from, of course, Sinopharm. China supplied, was the first to actually supply.
The current UN General Assembly president is also stressing the need to increase vaccine supply in Africa and across the developing world, something China is pledging to do both through the COVAX program and other partnerships.
There is no alternative but to vaccinate the entire world, because we have clearly come to know that no one is safe until everyone is safe. So there is no choice. It is clearly demonstrated. So we have to make every effort to get to that point, achieve that target.
The pandemic is just one of the major global challenges China and the UN are trying to solve. Next, we take a look at the push to address climate change. And as we go to break, Sarah Walton gives us a look at a daily tradition at UN headquarters.
Flag raising begins at 8 a.m. prompt every weekday here at the United Nations. There are 196 in total, so that's a flag for the United Nations and for every member state, and so that includes a flag for the People's Republic of China. And we're going to see that being put up now. So we've got some nice weather for the flag raising today. The sun has just come up here in New York. It's not very windy, so we may not see this flag flapping around, but still some nice weather for the flag raising today. Now, these flags here are in alphabetical order, so China sits between Chile and Colombia. Each flag's the same size, which is 123 by 183 centimetres, so that's 4 feet by 6 feet. The flags go up every day, except for weekends, and during bad weather they don't put them up either, but they are left up all through the General Assembly's high-level week in September. Now, all the member states are represented here, as well as the flags of 2 non-member states, that's the Holy See and Palestine. China's flag has been flown here since 1971, after all member states of the General Assembly voted in October of that year to recognize the People's Republic of China as the only legitimate representative of China to the United Nations. Now, the flags here are really one of the most distinctive features of the UN headquarters today. They are one of the first things that are seen by everyone, from visiting world leaders to tourists, when they come to the site. And the flying of all the flags side by side is really kind of symbolic of the equal status of all of the member states here at the United Nations. Sarah Walton, CGTN, New York.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
We are CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Preserving the planet we call home is one of the top priorities for China and the United Nations. And China has taken on a leading role. It recently hosted the COP15 meeting on biodiversity in Kunming. China also launched a plan recently to establish several national parks with the goal of protecting species and the environment. As the world prepares for the critically important COP26 meetings next month, China is pledging ambitious plans to reduce carbon emissions at home and abroad. President Xi Jinping made the announcement during this year's UN General Assembly.
China will strive to reprieve carbon dioxide emissions before 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality before 2060. This requires tremendous hard work, but we will make every effort to meet these goals. China will help out developing countries to realize green energy and low carbon development. No overseas coal plant construction will be initiated by China.
And that plan to scale back on foreign coal plants won applause from many leaders, including the UN General Assembly President.
I think it's very, very significant. It has been welcomed by many, many countries, including the United Kingdom. Prime Minister Boris Johnson, speaking at the general debate, highlighted the fact that President Xi has announced this. It means that countries are actually taking positive steps. It's very significant.
And heeding the call for greener development, dozens of Chinese companies have announced roadmaps to become carbon neutral. The first industrial park to meet that goal is in the capital, Beijing. CGTN Sun Ye takes us there.
For all its 90,000 square meter range, the company that specializes in generating clean energy is employing many of its own products, from wind turbines to solar panels, and it offsets the remaining carbon emissions by buying carbon quotas in the country's expanding green exchange.
We've been exploring carbon-neutral solutions for a long time before 2021. Seeing that so many companies and industries have made it their goal, we wanted to be the first to complete and offer such solutions.
They're having smaller individual steps too. The compound encourages the use of electric cars as well as walking for its more than 3,000 staff, all part of its green energy plan.
We're putting forward carbon-neutral proposals at the two sessions, too. We hope to soon engage a batch of cities, industrial parks and villages that have put forward carbon reduction plans to try out various green measures and make them carbon-neutral models.
Many companies in China are already joining Goldwing in setting up their own botanic gardens and vegetable greenhouses to take in carbon dioxide, as all of China are working to meet the green goal of becoming carbon neutral by the year 2060. Sun Ye, CGTN, Beijing.
CGTN's Sean Calebs joins me now with a closer look at China's climate goals. And Sean, they are ambitious and they're setting a high bar.
Yeah, indeed. But, you know, it's interesting as well, moving forward, it's always, what have you done for me lately? We heard President Xi Jinping talk about the fact that China has vowed not to fund any coal-fired plants overseas, outside of China, in the future. And although we mentioned it earlier, it is worth really focusing on how significant that is. Also, China has made it clear that it wants to become carbon neutral by 2060, and also its peak carbon emissions, meaning when emissions will become the worst. President Xi Jinping has made it clear China wants to do that before the year 2030. But still, the UN continues to lean on China, saying that it is so important that China pare back its carbon emissions, because it has been widely reported that China produces more carbon than any other nation on Earth. But to put that in perspective, since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, the United States has actually pumped more carbon into the atmosphere than any other nation. So when the U.S. and other nations talk about China needing to do more, that gives you a little context on why China always points to the more wealthy nations, why they need to do more to curb their carbon emissions and also help out those developing nations, whether on the continent of Africa, in India, or other areas, before focusing on China and other nations. Elaine?
So, Sean, that being said, the UN Secretary General did commend China's recent efforts, to your point, though, but is asking even more for China to do even more ahead of COP26 coming up at the end of this week, early next week. What is China's take on that recent statement?
Well, it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out, because really China and the United States were the leaders in pushing through the Paris Climate Accord back in 2015. And without the leadership of both U.S. President Obama and President Xi Jinping, that probably would not have happened. And it really speaks volumes about the effort to bring all of those nations together to try to find a way to pare back these emissions and move forward. The question is it going to be enough? Is it going to be followed through? Because making those promises is one thing, and sticking with them is entirely different. But China has done a very good job in terms of meeting its goals on renewable energy. It is the world leader in solar power, also wind power. You saw about the one community that China has that has really grown and become a very carbon neutral area. And that is the goal for a lot of China. But it is going to take time. This is a nation of 1.4 billion people and has extreme poverty and extreme wealth.
So we did see that China recently eradicated extreme poverty, lifting tens of millions, hundreds of million people out of poverty. And that has actually played a role in its climate goals. You and I have talked about that. There is now a massive middle class. Tell us more.
Yeah, and there you see some of just the beautiful scenery in China. And Elaine, you and I are among the lucky ones who have had a chance to travel extensively in China during the 9+ years that we have worked here. And during that decade, it is really hard to stress just how much China has changed, how much it has grown. It has become economically stronger, its military has become stronger, and also its voice around the world has become stronger. So the nations focus on what China is saying, so it is really important for them. And you're exactly right when you talk about education and lifting hundreds of people out of poverty. That really goes hand in hand with chipping away at climate change and helping people understand why it is important to stop driving old cars and to stop using two-stroke engines and reduce these carbon emissions. People in China, there's a massive middle class, some 800 million people, and they don't want to see their children playing outside with masks on in the summer. And it's not just the industrial pollution. There's a large desert, the Gobi Desert to the west, and China has tried extensively to build what's called the Green Wall, a lot of trees there, to reduce that desertification, if you will, and have all that sand blow in. So China has a great deal of work on its hands, but it has a growing middle class, people who want to see change, and clearly a leadership that wants to keep its foot on the accelerator and continue working towards chipping away at all those goals and keeping the carbon emissions from rising the global temperature less than 1.5 degrees centigrade by the end of the century.
And we want to point out that China has not wavered in recent years when it comes to global leadership on climate. It's actually remained very consistent, so it's evolved. What does the future hold here when it comes to global leadership?
You know, I think that's very key the way you phrase that, because it has remained consistent and really a world leader in the past decade, if you will. But first, again, let's give that some context, because there was a big climate meeting in Copenhagen back in 2009, and whether rightly or wrongly, China was blamed for fighting the proposals at that measure and keeping that climate accord from being approved back in 2009. Well, fast forward just a few years, and China is taking a lead role. It's realized that that China has the ability and needs to do everything possible to reduce the emissions and also reduce pollution. And with so many nations that it works with internationally along the Belt and Road, its massive economic and social program that is now being implemented, it has the ability to make all these changes. And President Xi Jinping has received a lot of credit for his ability to continue to push this through. And now, let's understand, the relationship between the United States and China has really soured in recent years, especially under the Trump administration. It certainly has not got any better the first year with Joe Biden as the U.S. president. But when Donald Trump pulled the United States out of the Paris Accord back during his administration, universally it was heralded as perhaps risky at worst and irresponsible even. So when the United States comes and says, you know, we need to work with China, we understand we're going to have a competitive relationship with them, but there are some things we can work on, and that chiefly has been climate, but there still has a long way to go. The United States has appointed former U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry as its climate envoy, and he has met with leading Chinese officials. And Kerry's made it clear to the Biden administration, if indeed the United States is going to find a way to work with China to reduce carbon emissions, to keep the global temperature from rising, the relationship has to improve with China. So this upcoming meeting in Glasgow is going to be very important, and obviously the way the U.S.-China relationship continues to grow and change over the next year, 2 years, is going to be equally as important, Elaine.
All right, Sean Caleb's with that in our Washington newsroom. Thank you. When we return, a look at China's role in meeting the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, including eradicating poverty.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with global business, only on CGTN.
We are CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Breaking news, we are getting word that Chinese Vice Premier Liu He and U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen held a video call. Beijing says the two sides conducted pragmatic, candid, and constructive exchanges on the macroeconomic situation and cooperation in multilateral and bilateral fields. Now, both sides said they believe the recovery of the world economy is at a critical juncture and see communications between the two sides as very important. The two parties agree to continue to communicate. Now, ending poverty is one of the highest priorities on the United Nations list of Sustainable Development Goals. And China's fight to eradicate extreme poverty is a key example of how these goals can be met. China's poverty alleviation campaign has transformed the country and garnered praise worldwide. CGTN's Ma Ke shows us how the effort has changed lives in Sichuan province.
This resettlement area is a common sight in the mountains of Liangshan. The houses may look a bit homogenized from the outside, but they are a great improvement from what most residents used to live in.
My husband and I used to live in a very small hut up there. We didn't have electricity or heating. It was always cold and damp, and there were no good roads. Once he got sick in winter, and I had to carry him down the hill because the small paths were all covered by snow.
While the country worked to eradicate extreme poverty in its rural areas, Liangshan worked to meet its own targets too. By last November, all impoverished counties in the prefecture had been removed from the poverty list, and many residents had new homes to boot.
I used to walk hours along mountain roads to go to school. Now I live in a house not far from campus. It's really convenient.
I didn't want to leave my old place, but harvests were too low and unstable, so we moved. Now I work at this apple orchard. My income has quintupled.
The closest hospital used to be days away. Sometimes people die of diseases that could have been cured in their early stages. Now we have this new clinic that serves 500 households. People find it easier to get help, especially the elderly.
There are over 10 million Yi people in China, and 1/4 of them live in Liangshan, a place once referred to as the hardest nut to crack in China's poverty eradication program. Even so, the prefecture worked hard and managed to bring nearly 1 million people out of poverty. Ma Ke, CGTN, Liangshan.
Alleviating poverty is part of a much bigger goal of sustainable development for countries around the world. Goals that are designed to help foster global peace and prosperity. Achim Steiner is the administrator of the UN's development program.
You know, UNDP was one of the first UN entities to engage with, a team in China almost 50 years ago. And in that sense, we have been partners in China's development pathways and strategies for decades, both contributing to the choices, the strategies that China has developed, but also in more recent years, learning from some of the success stories. Poverty eradication remains one of China's most remarkable achievements over the last 30, 40 years. But also, in supporting the development of a hydrogen-based economy. UNDP has been a proud partner to China's efforts to develop, both in the research, but also in the private sector, the manufacturing, the use of hydrogen for transport in public sector vehicles, a new technology. We are a development organization, and together with China, we have tried to bring the best of our experience and expertise to how you bring a new technology into a market that 15, 20 years ago did not even think of this as a possibility.
China is engaged around the world in a number of projects which are aimed at sustainable development. Chief among them, building a new Silk Road. The Belt and Road Initiative is the world's largest platform for international cooperation. More than 170 countries and organizations have signed onto the project, which increases trade and builds needed infrastructure. Building infrastructure is also a key goal for the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or AIIB. It's a multilateral development bank focused on Asia, but has members around the world. It helps finance green infrastructure and other innovative projects. And Shanghai hosts the China International Import Expo. Established in 2018, the expo welcomes vendors from around the world and has sealed more than $200 billion worth of deals. China is also helping developing countries by strengthening South-South cooperation and reducing or eliminating debts. The interim director of the UN's Office of South-South Cooperation stressed the importance of China's role.
China is coming as a leading country now in providing resources to other countries, whether grants, whether concessional loans, whether also loans, interest-free loans in many developing countries. So the impact of the country itself is coming actually in two ways. The model, because China, with its tremendous progress in the last decades, it shows, how other developing countries can follow a successful path to grow, in a very rapid pace. Just to give you an example, from the Human Development Index, I just came across the figure that from 1990 to 2019, the gross national income of China increased 994%, so almost 1,000%. So it shows, how a country that made this in poverty eradication, and now China is still a developing country because it is an upper middle income country. So there are still challenges, but as I said, China is a model and also as a provider. So at two levels, China actually is helping other developing countries to show the path, and also providing support, financial support and trade support to other developing countries.
Our look at China's role in peacekeeping efforts is coming up next. Mali is among the countries where China takes part in UN peacekeeping missions. The military observers shared what they experienced in the field.
A suicide car bomb exploded at a French military base in Gao, a town in central Mali. It was only about 1.8 kilometers from the Chinese peacekeeping force camp. We had to get prepared immediately.
During such missions, we've helped the local governments build schools. We talk to young kids and celebrate festivals together. We've also taught people how to farm.
Jean-Pierre Lacroix is the UN Undersecretary for Peace Operations. He explains more about China's role in the effort.
Peacekeeping is very much a collective effort. We need the support of our member states, and we need the support of those member states who have strong capacities and means, and that is the case with China. We have more than 2,000 Chinese peacekeepers. They're providing an excellent service in the missions in which they serve. But in addition to that, China is now the second largest financial contributors to peacekeeping, and that is, of course, also very important to that. So we very much count on that support from China. I have to say that we've also benefited from voluntary contribution from China, which are critical to helping us implement some of the key projects that we have with the objective of improving the impact and effectiveness of peacekeeping.
Peacekeeping is just one of the key tenets of multilateralism, one of the guiding principles of the UN. Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi highlighted the importance of those concepts.
The international system can only be based on the UN Center norms. International order can only be based on international law. And the common rules can only be adapted through the principles of international relations under the UN Charter.
As we've been discussing, China's role in the United Nations has evolved over the past 50 years. We'll bring in Einar Tangen in Beijing for final reflections. But first, let's start with Sarah Walton at UN headquarters in New York. So, Sarah, how do you see China's role developing into the future?
Well, I think we're going to continue seeing China look for ways to keep growing its role, its presence and influence here at the United Nations. And it's going to do that by focusing on the key UN issues, what we've been hearing about over the last hour. So in the short term, fighting COVID-19, supporting the Small Development Goals, fighting climate change, something that is already such a key focus for China. And I think it's going to continue to have that central role in peacekeeping efforts around the world. But what's going to be particularly interesting is to see the relationships that China develops here at the UN. We heard from President Xi Jinping when he addressed the United Nations General Assembly just last month that he believes the UN should be the main forum for international decision-making, for multilateralism. And so while we see tensions growing these days between China and other major powers around the world, like the United States, for example, what is really important for China at the UN is finding areas and issues that it can work with other member states. So climate change, for example, because it is through that cooperation that China will be able to help implement real change and so cement its role as a key player here at the United Nations.
All right, thank you so much for that, Sarah. Now let's turn to Einar Tangen in Beijing, a political and economic affairs commentator. So, Einar, the next 50 years for China and your reflections on what's ahead.
Well, obviously, climate change is looming. The question is, will the world come together? I mean, China over the last 50 years has been a major contributor to the UN and also a major beneficiary. The world order, as it was, helped China get to where it is. And I think the plan for on China's part is to see more of the world do more of the same. A world that is able to satisfy its necessities, to provide for their people, is a more stable world. And it's not a world that, will go into crisis easily. I mean, everything from building capacity in terms of the pandemic. You have a situation there where we know there will be more problems in the future. So rather than, keeping its IP to itself, China's building factories that can produce in the future anything that's necessary to guard the world against these type of problems. So China wants to be a responsible stakeholder. The question is, will other countries join in?
All right, and we'll leave it there. Einar Tangen in Beijing. Thank you so much. And that wraps up our special on the 50th anniversary of the People's Republic of China's return to the United Nations. Thanks so much for watching. I'm ELAINE Reyes. We leave you with some images of the PRC's participation at the UN over the years.
新中国恢复在联合国合法席位以来的50年。
Equatorial Guinea? Yes. Ethiopia? Yes. Yes. Poland? Yes. Yes. Portugal? Yes. China.